I'm here today with George Soros. As the 10th anniversary of the Lehman Brothers crisis and the climax of the great financial crisis approaches us, I thought it would be a good time for us to reflect on what happened and understand what might have happened and look forward to the challenges we now face. Thanks for joining me, George.
It's my pleasure.
So, Lehman Brothers fails on September 15th, and you and I were in discussion about the ramifications for social policy. Very quickly, the Treasury Secretary Paulson and Ben Bernanke of the Fed went to the Congress and said, we must do something or the economy as you know it might collapse. You and I talked about this, and I'm curious to reflect now on what did you see at the time and what did you recommend as the TARP legislation was approaching?
Well, actually, we were very much doing it together.
Yes.
Because we both believed that TARP was designed by Paulson the wrong way, because it was designed to take over the bad debts of the banks, instead of using it to inject money into the capital equity of the banks. When you put money into equity, it has at that time the leverage was roughly 20 to 1. So it was 20 times more powerful money injected at the level of the equity than at the level of the balance sheet.
Yes.
And $800 billion would have been actually sufficient to recapitalize the banks, to provide relief for the mortgage holders, and correct the imbalance in the economy.
But they didn't do that in the design, and with the help of our friends Robert Duggar, Congressman Jim Moran in the House of Representatives, and Chairman Barney Frank, you inspired a conversation.
Yeah, and we arranged a question to Barney Frank whether it is in the spirit of the legislation that money should be injected at the equity level, and he gave an answer in the affirmative, which then opened the way for using it that way.
Which Paulson ultimately did invoke and utilize, though perhaps in a way I know that you didn't entirely agree with, because it was not voluntary, it was compulsory for many banks.
Yeah, and he called in leaders of the banks and forced them to take a certain amount that he allocated to them, and by doing that, he actually stigmatized the banks.
And that, by the way, is in contrast with how the British authorities, under Gordon Brown and his Chancellor of the Exchequer, did their bailouts, where they told everyone, you have to raise equity, and we will help you, but if you can do it in the market, you don't have to resort to us. And Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyd's did require assistance, where the equity injection essentially gave control to the government for a temporary period, but the others were able to raise capital and, as you say, avoid the stigma of being forced to take capital. Shortly after that TARP legislation, developments started to emerge in Europe.
I think we should follow up a little bit, because it was Paulson who designed it, but then in November, Obama won the elections.
Yes.
And was in charge. And then it had to decide what policy to follow, because the money hadn't yet been distributed except a small amount. But the Obama administration decided to continue the way Paulson started. And I was, and particularly was involved in a discussion with Larry Summers, to whom I was very close. And I was arguing with him to change and to inject money at the equity level, because it would have still would have been sufficient to recapitalize the banks.
Yes.
And he refused. He objected that that would mean nationalizing the banks, and that was socialism, and the U.S. is not a socialist country.
But Larry may have been right in one respect, that there would have been resistance to that design that you and I have, advocated. On the other hand, they had already socialized the downside. The only thing we were talking about was sharing with the taxpayers in the recovery through ownership of equity.
And don't forget that Obama was at the height of his powers.
Yes.
He'd been elected, he had tremendous popularity, and had he been a little bit more radical, he could have prevailed.
Yes. We'll come back and talk a little bit about what the political controversy surrounding the bailout meant for politics in subsequent elections. But let's go to Europe just momentarily, because I know you felt there were some very profound statements made at an IMF meeting following.
Well, basically, the euro was at a critical point, because it had some inadequacies that the designers actually were aware of, but they thought that having built up the European Union from the coal and steel community by taking small steps, setting a date, and then gathering the political support, they developed it step by step, and they felt that when this step would be needed, because basically the Maastricht Treaty created a common currency, but it didn't create a common treasury.
Yes.
That was missing, a big deficiency.
Or a common banking union for the financial regulation of all the financial institutions within the EU. None of those things were they were in the initial vision, but they were not implemented at the outset.
But the big thing was, it was half, namely a currency, but no treasury.
Yes.
So that's the missing element. But they thought that when the time comes, they could get the support, the political will to create it. And this is where things went wrong, because there was a big financial crisis. Lehman failed, and the finance ministers of Europe left the IMF meeting a day early and reconvened in Europe, and they announced that no other systemically important institution will be allowed to fail. and that calmed the markets. But then Chancellor Merkel said, I think a couple of weeks later, that yes, but each country has to take care of its own banks. And that was the failure of Europe to take the next step and have a common treasury.
Yes.
And then later on, Merkel said, not over my dead body.
Yes. And I would imagine
she read the public opinion certainly of Germany,
yes,
the right way, actually, by saying that. But that meant that basically Germany, which was the leading country in Europe, failed to rise to the occasion.
Yes. And if I had been the finance minister of Ireland on the day she gave that speech, it would have been terrifying, because the fiscal burden of all the European banks that had branches in Ireland became enormous when it was not borne by everyone in Europe, but only by the Irish fiscal power. That was a very, very traumatic experience.
But not only for Ireland.
No.
Because there were other countries, the so-called peripheral countries, that were in the same situation.
Yes. So Europe then is, how would I say, a work in progress, but the progress stalls and it starts to disintegrate.
Well, this led basically to the Euro crisis, because the European banks were deeply involved in the various derivatives and that the American banks issued, securities, and so they were basically failing, and again it was the banks that were bailed out.
And the European banks, as they were failing based on the losses from their American holdings, started to contract their balance sheet, and what the scholar Guillermo Cavill calls a sudden stop of capital flows from creditor to debtor nations put the debtor nations, particularly in Southern Europe, into a very difficult position.
Right, and I wrote a number of books. I called it The Tragedy of Europe.
Yes. So, George, turning back to the United States, there was the bailouts and a fiscal bill put forward to stimulate the macroeconomy. But at the same time, it seemed that there was a residue of tension. There seemed to be a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. Many people, the Tea Party on the right and Occupy movement on the left, were forming, and they both felt that the government was taking care of the powerful and not the people. And the most profound evidence of that was something that you had objected to going all the way back to TARP, which is money needed to be used to relieve the burden of the mortgage overhang. All of the people who had mortgages that were deeply underwater did not receive any relief.
Yeah. Well, there was an additional problem with providing relief for the mortgage holders. I think Obama could have prevailed if he had been advised well to inject capital in the banks. There I hold Larry Summers responsible. But when it came to bailing out the mortgage holders, there would have been an uprising by the majority of house owners who never took out mortgages, who would have objected to bailing out the
people who took too big a mortgage.
Yeah. So it was unfortunate, but we were looking for ways to to compensate them,
Yes.
but we actually never found it, because we actually had to abandon the effort because the problem didn't arise because Obama had decided to follow the route on which Paulson embarked. So we had.
And I also know that the Geithner Treasury was very conflicted because these mortgages were not easily matched with a creditor because they had all been bundled into securities. And that process of restructuring, I think, could have been handled, but it required a great boldness from the Treasury to do that.
Yeah.
So we move now to the electoral process. Obama has done the bill for fiscal stimulus. They've done the bailouts in the way they did. The tensions are rising with Occupy and the Tea Party. And the first stop is after Senator Edward Kennedy died, they held an election. And that election was in 2010 in January, right after the large Wall Street firms had paid extravagant bonuses, which, in contrast to having just been bailed out, seemed to enrage people. And by the fall of that 2010, the midterm election, the House turned to Republican control.
Yeah. And then the next elections, I think Senate, in 2014.
Yes.
And then Trump was elected in 2016. So that was the political price. I think it's really, you shouldn't give the same weight to the Occupy movement as we should give to the Tea Party. The Tea Party consisted of two components. One were the small businessmen who had been deprived of their livelihood by
the failures, the lack of relief, and that their small banks, their community banks, were not bailed out and supported like the big banks.
So that was one component, and the other one were actually the evangelical Christians. It's a strange combination, but it was a very powerful one because they got tremendous financial support from the Koch brothers, who had actually a different reason for supporting them, because they were producing.
They're in the energy business.
Dirty energy, and so they wanted to protect their business.
Well, their efforts on the right obviously prevailed, if you say Occupy's on the left, because the politics of both House, Senate, and White House are now controlled by the Republicans.
So it's really the Tea Party and the support that they got from the Koch brothers that made them so influential.
Yes. We go back to TARP again for a moment. I remember right as the bill was passing, you said to me, "This is a very dangerous moment. We may have to do something." You talked about the 1931 Austrian and German banking crisis. You talked about how unsettling that was in the disintegration of societies at that time, and were concerned that something similar might be unleashed as a result of the financial crisis.
Yeah, and I had a similar conversation with Anatol Kaletsky in Davos.
Yes, right in January of 2009.
Yeah.
And right after that, we got together, and you said you would like me to do a fact-finding mission of how the economics and financial economics profession would respond to this. And it culminated by October of 2009 in a group of 30 economists, including many Nobel laureates from all over the world, came to Bedford in New York to discuss the failures of the experts.
Yeah, and that was the foundation of INET.
Yes, yes. And I remember after 3 days, we had been talking almost daily for months, but after 3 days with these people, you and I sat down for lunch.
Yeah.
And I looked at you, I didn't say anything, and you said, this profession is more beat down than I thought. We have to do something.
Yeah.
And you could see from the leaders of the profession, people like Jeffrey Sachs, George Akerlof, James Merlees, there were clear awarenesses across the spectrum. Some of these were conservative economists, some were very left-wing, but they all knew something was out of sorts.
Yeah, and I think INET has achieved a great deal in the last 10 years, both in changing the profession, but also in influencing policy.
Well,
so I kind of played the same role with INET as the Koch brothers did with Tea Party, but they were doing it to further their business, and I did it because I was concerned with and I am concerned with the future
yes.
of humanity.
Well, let's talk about that future. Here we stand right at this 10-year anniversary. Are there things that unfolded in those 10 years that particularly surprised you?
Well, basically, things have been going the wrong way. A lot of it, of course, was due to the fact that the United States was moving in the wrong direction, because the U.S. had been the supporter of open society idea all over the world, not an impartial supporter. So it was, but it was at least one of the objectives of American policy to help democratic development all over the world.
Yes.
And the U.S. was going in the wrong direction. I mean, basically, I distinguish between two kinds of regimes. One where the elected leaders are supposed to protect the individual freedom. That's what I call open society. And the other, where the rulers are using all the levers of power that they control to maintain themselves in power and to enrich themselves personally. And that's, we call it closer society, but more appropriately, you should call the dictatorship or
authoritarian
regime.
Yes. And I know we've had conversations, and in just the past year, you gave a very passionate speech at Davos about the role of technology and technological monopolies and the danger that they will help the authoritarian control be centralized and strengthened.
Yeah, well, that's what is now posing an unprecedented threat to open society globally, because the techniques of AI are designed or are more suitable to control, to exercise control over the behavior of the individuals, then that is a problem for open society that needs to be controlled. Also the rise of big tech monopolies. So both monopolies and the development of AI are combined they are threats to
Yes.
open society, and they are technological devices to improve the ability of dictatorships to control the individuals under their rule.
Mm-hmm.
And in this respect, Xi Jinping's China threatens is a tremendous threat to the to open society. Fortunately, there is resistance within the Chinese people to the rise of Xi Jinping, and this is not well known to the general public, but he actually was rebuffed at the Baidu conference this summer, and the retired leaders like Zhu Rongji and so on have still a lot of respect, and there is also a tradition in the history of the Chinese empires that the advisors of the emperor should actually voice their opposition, even if it means that they are going to be killed. So there was this resistance, and he's been taken down a peg, and apparently there is a real strong desire among the Chinese people to resist Xi Jinping. So since democracy can't be imposed from the outside, we really have to find ways to support the Chinese people in asserting their devotion to democracy.
So we look around the world 10 years after the crisis, and we see tumult in Europe, an unresolved Eurozone, more authoritarian energy in Europe. In the United States, they've relinquished the role of providing what you might call the public goods, the underpinnings for democracy, and we see the rise of China. This is a very, very challenging and ominous time.
But things have been going the wrong way.
Yes.
There's no question about it. Open society is under siege and fighting a rearguard battle trying to protect what has been achieved. But I think, and basically up till this point, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But I think that the tide is about to turn, and I think that in November the change will come in the U.S., and I think the Democrats will win both houses of Congress, and that will have a tremendous effect also on Europe, because in Europe things are still moving in the wrong direction with the rise of Orban and in Hungary and Salvini in Italy and Bannon trying to organize a sort of a league of leagues fighting for a different, the opposite of the values that have led to the creation of the European Union.
So George, I too hope that the kind of change you envision for November in the midterm elections in the United States comes to be realized and passes on constructive energy to Europe and the rest of the world. But I want to thank you for the support you give to INET and to Open Society and allow us to continue trying to support a constructive change in this world.
Keep up the good work.
We'll try.